Margaret Chen stood at the bus stop on Maple Street, holding a small brown folder against her chest. The folder was old and worn at the edges. Inside were 3 sheets of music that she had written by hand. Her writing was neat but simple. She had copied the notes from memory, the same songs her grandmother had taught her many years ago. The bus arrived 5 minutes late. Margaret climbed the steps slowly and found a seat near the back. She always sat in the back. It was quieter there, and she could watch the world go by without anyone watching her. Through the window, she saw the community center getting closer. Her heart began to beat faster. Margaret had never performed music for other people before. She was 52 years old and worked as a cleaner at the city hospital. Every day she mopped floors and cleaned windows. She worked the night shift, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. During the day she slept or did small jobs around her tiny apartment. She lived alone and liked it that way. The community center looked bigger than she remembered. Margaret had only been there once before, 3 weeks ago, to sign up for the piano recital. That day she had almost turned around and left. But Mrs. Patterson, her neighbor, had pushed her gently through the door. Mrs. Patterson was 83 years old and lived in the apartment next to Margaret's. The walls between their apartments were thin. For 6 months, Mrs. Patterson had been hearing piano music coming from Margaret's apartment. At first, she thought it was a radio or television. But the music was always different. It was beautiful and sad at the same time. One day, Mrs. Patterson knocked on Margaret's door. She wanted to know where the music was coming from. Margaret was embarrassed. She showed Mrs. Patterson the small electronic keyboard she had bought at a thrift store. It cost her $15. It was not a real piano, but it was all she could afford. Mrs. Patterson listened to Margaret play one song. When it was finished, the old woman had tears in her eyes. She told Margaret that she must share this gift with other people. Mrs. Patterson had been a music teacher for 40 years before she retired. She knew good music when she heard it. Now Margaret was walking into the community center and she felt very small. The building was full of people. There were young people with their parents. There were music teachers talking in groups. Everyone seemed to know each other. Everyone seemed to belong there except Margaret. She found a chair in the back corner of the main room. From there she could see the stage where a beautiful black piano waited. It was much bigger than any piano she had ever played. It was shiny and perfect. Margaret wondered if she would be able to make it sound good. The other people in the room were dressed nicely. The young people wore dark clothes that looked expensive. Their parents wore suits and dresses. Margaret looked down at her own clothes. She wore a simple blue cardigan that she had owned for 10 years. Her black pants were clean but old. Her shoes were comfortable walking shoes that she wore to work. Margaret opened her folder and looked at her music one more time. The notes looked so simple on the paper. She wondered if they would sound simple too. All around her she could hear other people talking about difficult pieces of music. They used words she did not understand. They talked about composers with long names. They talked about music schools and competitions. A woman with gray hair and a clipboard walked to the front of the room. She called for attention. This was Mrs. Williams, who organized the recital every year. She explained how the evening would work. Each person would play 1 or 2 pieces. A famous music professor would listen and give comments. At the end, there would be awards for the best performances. Mrs. Williams pointed to a man sitting in the front row. This was Dr. Harrison Miles. He was the music professor from the university. He had played piano concerts all over the world. He had written books about music. He was here to judge their playing. Dr. Miles looked serious and important. He wore a dark suit and expensive glasses. He had a notebook and a gold pen. Margaret watched him looking around the room at all the performers. His eyes moved quickly over her without stopping. She might as well have been invisible. The first performer was a girl about 16 years old. She had long black hair and wore a beautiful red dress. She walked to the piano like she owned it. She sat down and began to play something fast and complicated. Her fingers moved over the keys like they were dancing. Everyone watched her with respect. Margaret felt her stomach turn over. She did not belong here. These people were real musicians. They had studied music for years. They knew how to play the difficult pieces that impressed judges. Margaret only knew the simple songs her grandmother had taught her when she was a child. She thought about her grandmother now. Grandma Lee had lived with Margaret's family in a small village in Taiwan. They were poor, but Grandma Lee had an old piano that had been her mother's piano. Every day after school, Margaret would sit beside her grandmother on the piano bench. Grandma Lee's hands were soft and gentle. She smelled like jasmine tea and soap. Grandma Lee never taught Margaret to read music the way teachers did in school. Instead, she taught her to feel the music. She taught her to listen to the way notes wanted to move from one to another. She taught her to put her feelings into the sounds. Margaret learned many songs this way. Some were old Chinese folk songs. Some were songs that Grandma Lee had learned from her own mother. Some were songs that came from deep inside Grandma Lee's heart. Songs about missing home and loving family. When Margaret was 19, she came to America. She left everything behind, including the music. For 33 years, she had not touched a piano. She had been too busy working and surviving. She had forgotten that music was part of who she was. Then 6 months ago, she found the little keyboard at the thrift store. As soon as she touched the keys, everything came back. Her grandmother's songs were still there, waiting inside her fingers. She had been playing every night since then, very quietly, so the neighbors would not complain. Now she was here, in this room full of real musicians, and she felt like a fake. The girl in the red dress finished her piece. Everyone clapped loudly. Dr. Miles wrote something in his notebook and nodded with approval. Margaret looked at the list of performers. Her name was near the end. She had time to leave. She could walk out right now and no one would notice. She could go home to her quiet apartment and play her simple songs where no one could hear. But then she thought about Mrs. Patterson. The old woman had been so excited when Margaret told her about signing up for the Recital. Mrs. Patterson had even bought a new dress to wear to come and watch. She was probably already on her way to the community center. Margaret took a deep breath and settled back in her chair. She would stay. She would wait her turn. She would play her grandmother's songs even if everyone thought they were too simple, even if Dr. Miles looked bored, even if no one understood why these songs mattered. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the feeling of sitting next to Grandma Lee on the old piano bench. She tried to remember the smell of jasmine tea and the sound of her grandmother's gentle voice saying, "Music is not about being perfect, little one. Music is about telling the truth with your heart." Margaret watched as more young people performed their pieces. Each one seemed more talented than the last. A boy who looked about 14 played something that made his fingers fly across the keys so fast that Margaret could barely see them move. A girl with curly hair played a piece that was soft and beautiful, but also very complicated. Every note was perfect. After each performance, Dr. Miles would write something in his notebook. Sometimes he would nod. Sometimes he would whisper something to Mrs. Williams. Margaret tried to read his face, but he looked the same after every performance, serious and thoughtful. Margaret thought about how she had decided to sign up for this recital. It had been 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday evening. She had just finished her shift at the hospital and was walking home. The sun was coming up and the morning was quiet and peaceful. She had been thinking about her grandmother, as she often did when she walked home from work. That morning, she had decided to stop at the community center. There was a sign in the window about the piano recital. Margaret had read the sign many times before, but that morning she went inside to ask about it. The woman at the desk had been very kind. She explained that anyone could sign up to play. There was no cost. The only rule was that each person could play for no more than 5 minutes. The woman asked Margaret what she would like to play. Margaret had been quiet for a long time. She did not know what to say. She did not know the names of her grandmother's songs. Grandma Lee had never told her the official names. She had just called them things like the song about missing home or the song about spring rain. Finally, Margaret had said she would play a folk song. The woman wrote this down on the form. Margaret signed her name at the bottom. As she walked home that morning, she felt excited and scared at the same time. Now, sitting in the community center, Margaret felt much more scared than excited. She looked around the room again. Everyone else seemed so confident. The parents were taking pictures of their children. The young performers were talking with their friends about which music school they wanted to attend. Margaret had never been to music school. She had barely finished high school. When she came to America, she worked in a factory for 15 years. Then she learned to clean buildings and hospitals. She was good at her work, but it was not the kind of job that people talked about at parties. She thought about leaving again. There was still time. She could walk out the back door and no one would know she had been there. She could call Mrs. Patterson later and say that she had gotten sick. But as she was thinking about this, she saw Mrs. Patterson come through the front door. The old woman was wearing a dark blue dress that Margaret had never seen before. Her gray hair was styled nicely. She was using her walking stick, but she was moving carefully and with dignity. Mrs. Patterson looked around the room until she found Margaret. Then her whole face lit up with a smile. She made her way slowly through the crowd to where Margaret was sitting. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Patterson said as she sat down in the chair next to Margaret. "I am so proud of you for doing this. I have been looking forward to this evening for 3 weeks." Margaret felt her throat get tight. Mrs. Patterson had bought a new dress. She had come all this way, walking slowly with her stick. Margaret could not disappoint her now. "I am very nervous," Margaret whispered to Mrs. Patterson. "Of course you are nervous," Mrs. Patterson said. "Everyone is nervous before they perform. Even the most famous musicians get nervous. But you have something special, Margaret. Your music comes from your heart. That is more important than anything else." Margaret wanted to believe this, but she was not sure. She watched as another young person played a piece that seemed impossible. The music was loud and dramatic. It had parts that were very fast and parts that were very slow. When it was finished, the audience clapped for a long time. "That was very good," Margaret said to Mrs. Patterson. "Yes, it was technically very good," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "But did you feel anything when you heard it?" Margaret thought about this. The music had been impressive, but it had not made her feel anything special. It was like watching someone do a very difficult math problem correctly. You could admire the skill, but it did not touch your heart. "I do not think so," Margaret said. "Exactly," Mrs. Patterson said. "That young man played every note correctly. He had perfect timing and perfect technique. But he did not tell me a story. He did not share anything of himself with us. Your music is different. When you play, I can feel your grandmother's love. I can feel your own journey through life. That is much more valuable than perfect technique." Margaret hoped Mrs. Patterson was right, but she was still worried. She looked at her folder of music again. Her 3 songs looked so simple compared to what everyone else was playing. She had written them out by memory, but she was not sure she had gotten all the notes exactly right. She played them by feeling, not by reading. The first song was the one her grandmother had called the song about missing home. Grandma Lee had told her that this song was about missing China, but Margaret thought it could be about missing anyone or any place that you loved. When Margaret played this song, she thought about missing her grandmother. She thought about missing the feeling of being a child and having someone take care of her. The second song was the song about spring rain. This one was lighter and happier. Grandma Lee had taught her this song during a difficult time, when Margaret's father was sick. Grandma Lee said that even during the hardest times, spring always comes again. The rain always stops and flowers always grow. The third song was one that Margaret had changed over the years. It started as a simple melody that her grandmother had hummed while she cooked. But Margaret had added parts to it. She had made it longer and more complex. She called it the song about gratitude because it reminded her of all the good things in her life, even when life was hard. As Margaret was thinking about her songs, she noticed that the room was getting more crowded. More families were arriving. She saw some people who looked like music teachers. They were talking to Dr. Miles and shaking his hand. Everyone seemed to know him and respect him. Margaret felt smaller and smaller. What would these important people think when they heard her simple songs? What would they think when they found out that she cleaned toilets for a living? What would they think when they discovered that she had never had a real piano lesson in her life? "I think I should leave," Margaret whispered to Mrs. Patterson. "I do not belong here." Mrs. Patterson turned to look at Margaret with serious eyes. "Margaret Chen," she said firmly, "you have as much right to be here as anyone else. Music does not belong only to people with money or education. Music belongs to everyone. Your grandmother gave you a gift, and you have kept that gift alive for all these years. Now it is time to share it." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. She was scared, but she was also grateful to have Mrs. Patterson beside her. The old woman believed in her even when Margaret did not believe in herself. "What if I make mistakes?" Margaret asked. "Then you make mistakes," Mrs. Patterson said. "Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is that you try. The important thing is that you share your gift with the world." Margaret took a deep breath. She looked at the stage where the beautiful piano waited. She thought about her grandmother's hands on the keys of the old piano in Taiwan. She thought about the 6 months she had spent playing quietly in her apartment, rediscovering the music that lived inside her. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe it did not matter if her music was simple. Maybe it did not matter if she was not formally trained. Maybe what mattered was the love and memory and truth that she put into every note. Margaret squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hand. "Thank you for believing in me," she said. "Thank you for having the courage to be here," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Margaret settled back in her chair to wait for her turn. She was still nervous, but she was not going to leave. She was going to play her grandmother's songs, and she was going to play them with all the love and memory that lived in her heart. As Margaret sat waiting for her turn, her mind traveled back to her childhood in Taiwan. She was 7 years old again, standing in the doorway of her grandmother's small room. The room smelled like incense and old wood. In the corner stood the piano that would change her life. The piano was not beautiful like the one on the stage tonight. It was old and dark brown with scratches on its surface. Some of the keys were yellow with age. The sound was not perfect. But to young Margaret, it was the most wonderful thing in the world. Grandma Lee had gotten the piano from her own mother, who had died when Grandma Lee was very young. It was the only valuable thing their family owned. During the war, when soldiers came to take things from houses, Grandma Lee had hidden the piano in a barn. She had covered it with hay and old blankets. She had risked her life to save it. "This piano holds the voices of our family," Grandma Lee had told Margaret many times. "When you play it, you are speaking for all the women who came before you. You are keeping their stories alive." Margaret remembered the first time her grandmother lifted her onto the piano bench. Margaret's legs were too short to reach the pedals. Her hands were too small to stretch across all the keys. But Grandma Lee had been patient and gentle. "Do not worry about reaching everything," Grandma Lee had said. "Start with what you can touch. Music grows with you. As you grow bigger, your music will grow bigger too." Grandma Lee had taught Margaret to play by showing her, not by using books. She would put her own hands over Margaret's small hands and guide them to the right keys. She would hum the melodies until Margaret could hear them in her head. She would tell stories about what each song meant. Margaret learned that the song about missing home had been written by her great-great-grandmother, who had to leave her village during a flood. She had written the song to remember the house where she grew up, the fields where she played as a child, and the people she left behind. "Everyone has a place they miss," Grandma Lee had explained. "Sometimes it is a place you can never go back to. Sometimes it is a time in your life that is finished. This song helps us remember that missing something shows how much we have loved." Margaret had practiced this song every day for 2 years before she could play it all the way through. The melody was simple, but it had a way of getting into your heart and staying there. Even now, 33 years later, Margaret could play it with her eyes closed. The second song, the song about spring rain, had a different story. Grandma Lee had learned it from a traveling musician who came to their village when she was a teenager. The musician had been very old and had played many songs, but this one was Grandma Lee's favorite. "This song teaches us about hope," Grandma Lee had said. "In the winter, everything looks dead. The trees have no leaves. The flowers are gone. The ground is hard and cold. But under the ground, life is waiting. When the spring rain comes, everything wakes up again." This song reminds us that hard times do not last forever. Margaret had learned this song during the winter when her father was very sick. Every evening, she would play it for him. Her father could not speak much because of his illness, but she could see in his eyes that the music made him feel better. He died that spring, but Margaret always believed that the song had helped him have peaceful dreams during his last months. The third song was the most special to Margaret because she had helped create it. It started as a simple melody that Grandma Lee would hum while she cooked or cleaned. One day, when Margaret was 12, she had started playing the melody on the piano. She had added notes and changed the rhythm. She had made it longer and more complex. Grandma Lee had been so surprised and happy when she heard what Margaret had done. "You have made the song your own," she had said. "This is what music is for. You take what you learn, and you add your own heart to it. Now this song belongs to both of us." From that day on, Margaret had understood that music was not just about copying what other people did. It was about taking the old songs and making them new. It was about adding your own feelings and experiences to the melodies that came before you. Margaret had continued to play and learn until she was 19. By then, she could play more than 20 songs. Some were traditional Chinese folk songs, Some were songs that Grandma Lee had learned from other people. Some were songs that Margaret had created by changing and adding to the old melodies. But then everything changed. Margaret's family decided that she should go to America to find work and send money back home. It was a hard decision, but there were not many opportunities for young women in their village. America seemed like a place where Margaret could have a better life. Margaret had wanted to bring the piano with her, but it was impossible. The piano was too big and too expensive to ship. Besides, she was going to live in a small room with 3 other girls. There would be no space for a piano. The night before Margaret left Taiwan, Grandma Lee had taken her to the piano one last time. They had played their favorite songs together, with Grandma Lee's old hands moving beside Margaret's young hands on the keys. "Remember," Grandma Lee had said, "the music is not in the piano, the music is in you. You can take it with you wherever you go. Someday, when you are ready, you will find another piano, and all these songs will still be there waiting for you." Margaret had cried that night, but she had believed her grandmother. She had thought that she would find a piano in America and continue playing. She had thought that music would always be part of her life, but America had been much harder than she expected. Margaret had lived in a tiny room and worked in a factory that made clothes. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. She was always tired and always worried about money. There was no time for music and no money for a piano. After a few years, Margaret had met a man named David Chen. He was kind and hardworking, and he loved her. They got married and had 2 children. Margaret had stopped working at the factory to take care of the babies. David worked 2 jobs to support the family. For a while, Margaret had hoped that they could save money to buy a piano. She wanted to teach her children the songs that Grandma Lee had taught her. But there was never enough money. First, they needed a bigger apartment. Then they needed a car. Then the children needed clothes and school supplies and doctor visits. When the children were older, Margaret had gone back to work. She had learned to clean offices and hospitals. The work was hard, but it paid better than the factory. She worked at night so she could be home with her children during the day. The years went by quickly. The children grew up and moved away. David got sick and died when he was only 55. Margaret found herself alone in her small apartment, still working at night, still tired all the time. She had almost forgotten about the music. Sometimes she would hear a song on the radio that reminded her of her grandmother, and her heart would hurt with missing, but the pain was too strong. So she learned to turn off the radio and think about other things. It was not until 6 months ago, when she found the little keyboard at the thrift store, that everything came back. The moment she touched the keys, she could hear Grandma Lee's voice. She could smell the incense in the old room. She could feel her grandmother's hands guiding her own. All the songs were still there, just as Grandma Lee had promised. They had been waiting inside Margaret for 33 years, ready to come out again when she was ready to hear them. Now sitting in the community center, Margaret realized that she was finally ready to share these songs with other people. She was ready to honor her grandmother's memory by letting the music live again in the world. Mrs. Williams walked to the front of the room again with her clipboard. She looked at her list and called out, "Next, we have Sarah Johnson playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major." A girl with blonde hair and a black dress walked confidently to the piano. Margaret watched her sit down and adjust the bench with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. The girl's fingers moved across the keys like they were dancing. The music was smooth and flowing like water running over stones. When Sarah finished, the audience clapped politely. Dr. Miles nodded and wrote several lines in his notebook. Margaret could see that he was pleased with the performance. "Thank you, Sarah," Mrs. Williams said. "That was lovely. Next, we have Michael Chen playing Bach's Invention No. 8 in F major." Margaret felt a small shock when she heard the name Chen. For a moment, she wondered if this boy might be related to her somehow. But when he walked to the piano, she could see that he was not Asian. He was a tall boy with red hair, probably about 16 years old. Michael played his piece with great precision. Every note was exactly right. The timing was perfect. Margaret could tell that he had practiced this piece many times until he knew it completely. When he finished, Dr. Miles actually smiled and wrote more notes than he had for anyone else. Margaret looked at her simple folder again. She wondered what Dr. Miles would write about her performance. She wondered if he would even bother to write anything at all. Mrs. Williams called several more names. Each performer seemed more polished than the last. There was a girl who played something fast and dramatic that made the piano sound like thunder. There was a boy who played something soft and dreamy that reminded Margaret of floating clouds. All of these young people moved to the piano like they owned it. They sat down without hesitation. They played without looking at music sheets. They had clearly spent years learning their pieces perfectly. Margaret noticed that after each performance, the families of the performers looked proud and happy. Parents took pictures with their phones. Brothers and sisters clapped enthusiastically. Everyone seemed to know how to act at this kind of event. Margaret felt more and more out of place. She looked around the room and realized that almost everyone was well-dressed and confident. The parents wore expensive clothes and jewelry. They talked about their children's music lessons and competitions. They used words that Margaret did not understand. Jennifer has been studying with Professor Martinez at the conservatory, one mother was saying to another. She's preparing for her level 8 examinations next month. Oh, how wonderful, the other mother replied. Thomas just finished his level 6. His teacher says he has exceptional potential for the major scales. Margaret did not know what any of this meant. She did not know there were levels or examinations. She did not know what a conservatory was. She began to feel like she had wandered into a world where she did not speak the language. Mrs. Williams looked at her list again. Next, we have David Park playing Mozart's Sonata in C major first movement. A young man in a dark suit walked to the piano. He was probably in college, older than most of the other performers. He sat down and began to play something that was both beautiful and complicated. His hands moved independently of each other, playing different melodies at the same time. Margaret had never heard anything like it. When David finished, the audience clapped longer than they had for anyone else. Dr. Miles wrote many notes and nodded several times. Margaret heard someone behind her whisper, "He's going to win for sure." Margaret felt her stomach sink. If this was the level of playing that won prizes, she had no chance at all. Her simple folk songs would sound like children's music compared to what these people could do. Mrs. Williams continued calling names. Margaret listened as more young people played complex pieces with difficult names. She heard something called a prelude and fugue and something called a rhapsody. She heard pieces by composers named Liszt and Debussy and Rachmaninoff. With each performance, Margaret felt smaller and more invisible. She began to hope that Mrs. Williams would somehow skip her name. Maybe there had been a mistake with the sign-up form. Maybe Margaret's name was not really on the list. But then Mrs. Williams looked at her clipboard and said, "Next we have Margaret Chen." Margaret felt her heart stop. For a moment she could not move. Mrs. Patterson gently touched her arm. "That's you, dear," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "Go ahead." Margaret stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak and shaky. As she walked toward the front of the room, she became aware that people were looking at her. She heard whispers starting behind her. "Who is that?" someone asked. "I don't recognize her," another voice said. "She's not from any of the music schools," a third person added. Margaret felt her face get hot with embarrassment. She knew she looked different from everyone else. Her simple clothes and nervous manner made it obvious that she did not belong in this group of serious musicians. Mrs. Williams looked at her clipboard again, and then looked at Margaret with a puzzled expression. "Margaret Chen," she said. "And what will you be playing for us tonight?" Margaret's mouth felt dry. She had to clear her throat twice before she could speak. "I will play a folk song," she said quietly. "A folk song?" Mrs. Williams repeated, sounding surprised. "Which folk song? Do you have the sheet music with you?" Margaret held up her worn folder. "I have my own music here," she said. "It is a traditional song from Taiwan." Mrs. Williams looked uncertain. She glanced over at Dr. Miles, who was watching Margaret with a neutral expression. Margaret could not tell what he was thinking, but she did not think he looked interested. "I see," Mrs. Williams said. "Well, please go ahead." Margaret walked to the piano on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She could hear more whispers from the audience now. She caught fragments of conversations. A folk song. What is she doing here? This should be interesting. Margaret sat down at the piano bench and immediately felt how different this piano was from her little keyboard at home. The keys were heavier and more responsive. The sound was much richer and fuller. For a moment she was afraid that she would not be able to play her songs on such a fancy instrument. She looked out at the audience and saw Mrs. Patterson smiling at her encouragingly. Most of the other faces looked curious but not particularly welcoming. She could see parents checking their phones or whispering to each other. Several of the young performers were looking at her with expressions that seemed to say, "This will be over quickly." Dr. Miles was sitting in the front row with his notebook ready. He looked at Margaret with the polite but distant expression of someone who was doing his job, but not expecting to be impressed. Margaret could see that he was already thinking about the next performer. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment when she would either share her grandmother's gift with the world or embarrass herself in front of all these accomplished musicians. She thought about turning around and walking back to her seat. She could say that she was feeling sick. She could apologize for wasting everyone's time. No one would be surprised. Everyone already seemed to expect that she did not belong here, but then she thought about Grandma Lee sitting beside her on the old piano bench. She thought about the love and patience in her grandmother's voice as she taught Margaret each song. She thought about the years of joy and comfort that these melodies had brought to her life. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and tried to forget about the audience. She tried to forget about Dr. Miles and his notebook. She tried to forget about the whispers and the curious stares. Instead, she thought about her grandmother's small room with its smell of incense and old wood. She thought about the scratched piano with its yellow keys. She thought about the love that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. When Margaret opened her eyes, she was ready to play. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys and felt the smooth, cool surface beneath her fingertips. For a moment she hesitated. The piano was so much more responsive than her little keyboard at home. When she pressed a key gently, it made a soft, beautiful sound. When she pressed harder, the sound became fuller and richer. She decided to start with the song about missing home. This was the first song her grandmother had taught her, and it was the one that meant the most to her. She knew this song so well that she could play it even when she was nervous. Margaret pressed the first key, and a single clear note rang out through the room. It was a simple note, but it was perfect. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment before Margaret added the second note, and then the third. The melody began slowly and quietly. It was not dramatic like the pieces the other performers had played. It did not have fast runs of notes or complicated harmonies. It was just a simple melody that seemed to speak directly to the heart. As Margaret played, something wonderful began to happen. The nervousness that had been making her hands shake started to fade away. The whispers from the audience became background noise that she barely noticed. The critical eyes of Dr. Miles became less important than the music flowing from her fingers. Margaret felt herself transported back to her childhood. She could almost smell the incense in her grandmother's room. She could almost feel Grandma Lee sitting beside her on the piano bench. The music was not just notes on a page anymore. It was a conversation with someone she loved who was no longer there. The melody moved forward like a gentle river. It had sections that were sad and yearning, like someone looking back at a place they could never return to. But it also had sections that were warm and comforting, like the memory of being held and loved. Margaret had played this song thousands of times on her little keyboard, but playing it on this beautiful piano was different. Every note had more depth and meaning. The silence between the notes was as important as the notes themselves. The song seemed to fill the entire room with its gentle presence. As she played, Margaret began to forget where she was. She forgot about the audience watching her. She forgot about competing with the other performers. She forgot about feeling out of place and underdressed. All that mattered was the music and the connection she felt to her grandmother. The song had a section in the middle where the melody became more complex. Margaret had added this part herself over the years, building on what her grandmother had taught her. It was her own contribution to the family tradition, her own way of expressing the feelings that the song brought up in her. This middle section told the story of her own journey from Taiwan to America. It spoke of the loneliness and fear she had felt as a young woman in a strange country. It spoke of the years when she had been too busy surviving to think about music. But it also spoke of hope and resilience, of the strength that had carried her through difficult times. When Margaret reached this part of the song, her playing became more confident and expressive. Her fingers moved across the keys with increasing certainty. She was no longer the nervous woman who had walked to the piano a few minutes ago. She was a musician sharing something precious with the world. The room around Margaret began to change. The conversations and whispers that had been going on throughout the evening gradually stopped. People who had been checking their phones looked up. Parents who had been thinking about other things turned their attention to the stage. There was something in Margaret's music that was different from what they had heard before. The other performers had been technically excellent, but their music had been about showing off their skills. Margaret's music was about telling a story. It was about sharing real emotions and real experiences. Dr. Miles, who had been writing notes in his book with routine efficiency, stopped writing and looked up at Margaret. His expression began to change from polite disinterest to genuine attention. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, as if he wanted to hear every note more clearly. Margaret was completely unaware of the change happening in her audience. She was lost in the music, lost in the memories it brought back. She could see her grandmother's hands moving over the keys of the old piano. She could hear Grandma Lee's voice explaining what each part of the song meant. "This part is about the journey," her grandmother had said about the middle section. "Not just the journey from one place to another, but the journey from one part of your life to the next. Every person makes many journeys in their lifetime. Some are journeys of the body, and some are journeys of the heart." Margaret had understood this better as she got older. Her journey from Taiwan to America had been a journey of the body. But learning to live without music for 33 years and then finding it again had been a journey of the heart. As the song moved toward its ending, Margaret's playing became even more expressive. The final section was about acceptance and gratitude. It was about understanding that all the difficulties and losses in life were part of a larger pattern. It was about finding peace with the past and hope for the future. The last notes of the song were played very softly, like a whisper or a prayer. Margaret let each note fade completely before playing the next one. The silence between the notes seemed to echo with meaning. When Margaret played the final note, she let it hang in the air for a long moment before lifting her hands from the keys. Only then did she become aware of her surroundings again. Only then did she remember that she was sitting on a stage in front of a room full of people. The silence that followed was different from the polite attention that had greeted the other performers. This was a deeper silence, the kind that happens when people have been genuinely moved by something beautiful. Margaret turned slightly to look at the audience. She was surprised to see that everyone was looking directly at her. No one was checking their phone or whispering to their neighbor. Even the youngest children in the audience were sitting still and quiet. Mrs. Patterson had tears in her eyes and was smiling so widely that her whole face seemed to glow. Some of the other older people in the audience looked like they had been touched by something unexpected. Even some of the parents who had seemed so focused on their own children's performances were looking at Margaret with new interest. But it was Dr. Miles who surprised Margaret the most. The distinguished professor was staring at her with an expression of complete amazement. His notebook lay forgotten in his lap. His pen was still in his hand, but he was not writing anything. He was simply listening and watching as if he could not quite believe what he had just heard. Margaret realized that she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly and prepared to return to her seat. She had played one of her 3 songs and she felt good about it. She had shared her grandmother's gift with these people, and they had listened respectfully. But as she started to stand up, she heard something that made her pause. Someone in the audience had started to clap. It was not the quick, polite applause that had followed the other performances. It was slow and deliberate, as if the person clapping wanted to savor each moment. Other people began to join in. The applause grew slowly but steadily, like a wave building strength as it moved toward shore. Margaret looked out at the audience in wonder. These people were not just being polite. They were genuinely moved by what they had heard. Margaret sat back down at the piano bench. She still had 2 more songs to play. Dr. Harrison Miles had heard thousands of piano performances in his 40 years as a music professor. He had listened to students at the most prestigious music schools in the world. He had judged competitions where the most talented young musicians competed for prizes and recognition. He thought he had heard everything that a piano could do. But as Margaret Chen played her simple folk song, Dr. Miles felt something he had not experienced in years. He felt the hair on his arms stand up. He felt his heart beat faster. He felt tears coming to his eyes. This was not supposed to happen. Dr. Miles was here as a favor to Mrs. Williams, who had asked him to judge this small community recital. He had expected to hear a few hours of student performances, give some encouraging comments, and go home. He had not expected to hear anything that would challenge his understanding of what music could be. But Margaret's playing was doing exactly that. Dr. Miles had spent his career studying the technical aspects of piano performance. He knew about proper hand position and finger technique. He knew about rhythm and timing and musical interpretation. He could analyze any piece of music and explain exactly why it worked or why it did not work. Yet Margaret's playing defied all his usual categories. Her technique was not perfect by classical standards. Her hand position was sometimes unconventional. She played some notes with a timing that would have made his conservatory colleagues frown, but none of that mattered, because Margaret was doing something much more important than following rules. She was communicating directly from her heart to the hearts of everyone listening. She was using music the way it was meant to be used, not as a technical exercise, but as a language for expressing the deepest human emotions. Dr. Miles recognized something in Margaret's playing that he had been trying to teach his advanced students for years. She had what he called authentic voice. Most young pianists could play the notes correctly, but they played other people's music without adding anything of themselves to it. They were like actors reading lines without understanding the character they were supposed to be playing. Margaret, on the other hand, was not just playing her grandmother's song. She was living it. Every note came from a real place in her heart. Every phrase told part of her own story. She had taken a simple melody and made it into something profound and moving. As Margaret finished her first song and began her second, Dr. Miles found himself leaning forward in his chair. He wanted to catch every nuance of her playing. He wanted to understand how she was creating such powerful emotional effects with such simple means. The second song, the song about spring rain, was lighter and more hopeful than the first. Margaret played it with a gentle touch that made the piano sound like raindrops falling on leaves. But even in this happier song, Dr. Miles could hear layers of meaning. He could hear the sadness that came before the hope. He could hear the long winter of difficulty that made the spring rain so precious. He could hear the wisdom of someone who had lived through hard times and learned to appreciate the simple beauties of life. Dr. Miles thought about his own students, who often played much more technically difficult pieces but had never moved him the way Margaret was moving him now. His students could play Chopin and Liszt and Rachmaninoff with perfect accuracy, but they played these masters' emotions, not their own. Margaret was playing her own emotions, her own experiences, her own truth, and the result was music that spoke directly to the soul. As Margaret moved into her third song, Dr. Miles realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. This unknown woman, this hospital cleaner who had never had formal training, was giving one of the most authentic and moving performances he had ever heard. The third song was the most complex of the three. Dr. Miles could hear that Margaret had developed this piece over time, adding her own variations and interpretations to a simple melody. The musical development showed real sophistication, even though it did not follow classical forms. Margaret played with increasing confidence and expression. Her connection to the music was so complete that she seemed to become one with the piano. The instrument was no longer separate from her. It was an extension of her voice, her heart, her memory. Dr. Miles found himself thinking about his own relationship with music. He had started playing piano when he was 5 years old, because his parents thought it would be good for his education. He had continued because he was talented and because it led to a successful career. But when was the last time he had played something that came from his own heart, the way Margaret's music came from hers? He thought about the hundreds of recitals he had attended, the thousands of students he had taught, the countless hours he had spent analyzing and critiquing musical performances. All of that expertise seemed less important than what this simple woman was doing right now. Margaret was reminding him why music existed in the first place. It was not created to show off technical skill or to win competitions. It was created to help human beings express feelings that were too deep for words. It was created to connect people across time and space and culture. As Margaret's third song reached its climax, Dr. Miles felt something shift inside him. He realized that he had been approaching music backwards for most of his career. He had been focusing on the technique and forgetting about the heart. He had been teaching his students to play correctly, but not to play truthfully. Margaret finished her third song with the same gentle touch she had used throughout her performance. The final notes seemed to linger in the air like incense, creating a sacred space around the piano. Dr. Miles was the first person to stand up and applaud. He had never done this before in all his years of judging performances. He always waited for the polite applause to begin and then joined in appropriately. But Margaret's performance had moved him beyond the boundaries of professional propriety. As he stood and clapped, Dr. Miles felt tears running down his cheeks. He did not try to hide them. This was not a time for professional dignity. This was a time for honoring something beautiful and true. The rest of the audience followed Dr. Miles's lead. People began standing up throughout the room. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic. Children who had been fidgeting throughout the evening sat up and clapped with genuine excitement. Margaret looked out at the standing audience with amazement and confusion. She had expected polite tolerance, perhaps some gentle encouragement. She had not expected this overwhelming response. Mrs. Patterson was crying openly and clapping so hard that her hands must have hurt. The other performers, who had seemed so confident and accomplished earlier in the evening, were applauding with respect and admiration. Even the parents who had been focused on their own children's success were clearly moved by what they had just experienced. But it was Dr. Miles who mattered most to Margaret. She could see that the distinguished professor was genuinely affected by her music. His professional composure was completely gone. He was applauding not as a judge evaluating a performance, but as a human being responding to something that had touched his soul. Dr. Miles continued clapping until his hands were sore. He wanted Margaret to understand how much her music had meant to him. He wanted her to know that she had given him a gift that he would remember for the rest of his life. When the applause finally died down, Dr. Miles remained standing. He looked directly at Margaret and spoke loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "That," he said, "was extraordinary. That was what music is supposed to be." Margaret felt her heart swell with gratitude and joy. She had shared her grandmother's gift with the world, and the world had received it with open hearts. She had honored the memory of Grandma Lee and all the women who had come before her, but more than that, she had discovered something about herself. She was not just a hospital cleaner who played piano as a hobby. She was a musician. She had always been a musician, even during the 33 years when she had no piano to play. The music had been waiting inside her all along, just as her grandmother had promised. And now it was alive in the world again, ready to touch other hearts and carry forward the love that had created it. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity to Margaret. She sat at the piano bench, looking out at the standing audience, unable to believe what was happening. People were not just clapping politely. They were clapping with enthusiasm and emotion. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were smiling so widely that their faces seemed to glow. Margaret had never experienced anything like this in her entire life. At work, she was invisible. She cleaned the hospital floors and bathrooms while most people slept. During the day, she kept to herself in her small apartment. She had lived for years without anyone really noticing her or paying attention to what she could do. But tonight, in this room full of accomplished musicians and proud families, Margaret Chen was the center of attention. And it was not because she had made a mistake or caused a problem. It was because she had shared something beautiful. Mrs. Patterson was standing near the back of the room, applauding so enthusiastically that Margaret worried she might hurt herself. The elderly woman's face was wet with tears, but she was smiling like someone who had just witnessed a miracle. Margaret could see that Mrs. Patterson felt proud and vindicated. She had believed in Margaret when Margaret did not believe in herself, and now everyone could see that she had been right. Dr. Miles was still standing in the front row, still applauding. He was looking at Margaret with an expression of amazement and respect. Margaret had been so worried about disappointing this important professor, but now she could see that he was genuinely moved by her performance. What surprised Margaret even more was the reaction of the other performers. The young people who had played such technically difficult pieces were applauding with real enthusiasm. Margaret had expected them to be jealous or dismissive, but instead they seemed excited and inspired. Sarah Johnson, the girl who had played the beautiful Chopin piece, was clapping and nodding with appreciation. Michael Chen, the boy with red hair who had played Bach so perfectly, was applauding with a big smile on his face. Even David Park, the college student who everyone thought would win the competition, was standing and clapping with obvious respect. Margaret realized that these young musicians understood something that she had not expected them to understand. They recognized authentic artistry when they heard it. They could tell the difference between playing notes correctly and playing music truthfully. As the applause began to fade, people started to sit back down. But instead of moving on to the next performer, something unusual happened. Dr. Miles stepped forward and spoke to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I have been judging piano performances for more than 20 years. I have heard students from the finest music schools in the world. But what we just heard was something very special." He turned to look at Margaret, who was still sitting at the piano bench, overwhelmed by everything that was happening. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Miles continued, "your performance tonight has reminded all of us why music exists. Music is not about showing off technical skill. Although skill is certainly important, music is not about following rules perfectly, although understanding rules has its place. Music is about communicating human emotion and experience in a way that words cannot do." Dr. Miles paused and looked around the room. Everyone was listening intently to what he was saying. "Tonight, Mrs. Chen has shown us what it means to play with authentic voice. She has taken simple melodies and made them into something profound and moving. She has shared her own story, her own heart, her own truth with all of us. This is what every musician should aspire to do." Margaret felt her face getting hot with embarrassment and pride. She had never heard herself described this way before. She had always thought of herself as someone who just played simple songs for her own enjoyment. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Miles said, addressing her directly, "would you be willing to tell us a little bit about the music you just played? I think everyone here would be interested to know more about these beautiful songs." Margaret stood up slowly from the piano bench. Her legs still felt shaky, but her nervousness was different now. Earlier, she had been afraid of being judged and found wanting. Now she was nervous because she wanted to honor her grandmother's memory properly. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. Her voice was not very loud, so people leaned forward to hear her better. "These songs were taught to me by my grandmother when I was a child in Taiwan. She learned them from her mother and grandmother. They are very old songs that have been passed down in my family for many generations." Margaret paused, trying to find the right words to explain what these songs meant to her. "My grandmother told me that music is a way of keeping the voices of our family alive. When I play these songs, I am speaking for all the women who came before me. I am keeping their stories and their love alive in the world." Several people in the audience nodded with understanding. Margaret could see that her words were resonating with them. "I came to America when I was 19, Margaret continued. "For 33 years I did not have a piano to play. I thought the music was gone forever. But 6 months ago I found a small keyboard at a thrift store. When I touched the keys, all the songs came back to me. They had been waiting inside me all this time." Margaret looked out at the audience and saw faces full of attention and compassion. These people were really listening to her. They were interested in her story. "Tonight is the first time I have ever played for other people," Margaret said. "I was very scared. But my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, encouraged me to share these songs. She said that music should not be hidden. She said that gifts are meant to be shared." Margaret looked back at Mrs. Patterson, who was beaming with pride and joy. "I want to thank Mrs. Patterson for believing in me," Margaret said. "And I want to thank all of you for listening to my grandmother's songs with such kindness." The audience burst into applause again. This time, Margaret felt ready for it. She stood at the front of the room and accepted their appreciation with grace and gratitude. When the applause died down, something wonderful happened. Several people came forward to speak with Margaret personally. Dr. Miles was the first to approach her. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I would very much like to talk with you about your music. Would you be willing to meet with me sometime this week? I think there might be some opportunities that would interest you." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. This distinguished professor wanted to meet with her? What kinds of opportunities could he be talking about? Sarah Johnson, the young woman who had played Chopin, came up to Margaret next. "That was incredible," she said. "I've been taking piano lessons for 12 years, but I've never heard anything that moved me the way your music did tonight. Could you teach me some of your grandmother's songs?" Michael Chen, the red-haired boy who had played Bach, joined the conversation. "My teacher is always telling us to play with more emotion," he said. "But I never really understood what that meant until I heard you play. How do you put so much feeling into the music?" Margaret was amazed by these questions. These young people, who were so much more technically advanced than she was, wanted to learn from her. They understood that she had something valuable to offer, even though she had never been to music school. More people approached Margaret throughout the evening. Parents thanked her for sharing such beautiful music. Other performers asked her about her background and her songs. The evening that had started with Margaret feeling invisible and out of place ended with her surrounded by people who wanted to know more about her and her music. Mrs. Patterson finally made her way through the crowd to reach Margaret. The two women hugged each other tightly. "I am so proud of you," Mrs. Patterson whispered in Margaret's ear. "You have honored your grandmother's memory beautifully, and you have shown everyone here what real music sounds like." Margaret hugged her neighbor back, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Mrs. Patterson had seen something in Margaret that Margaret had not been able to see in herself. She had pushed Margaret to take this leap of faith, and it had changed everything. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Margaret realized that her life would never be the same. She was still the same person who cleaned floors at the hospital. She still lived in the same small apartment, but something fundamental had changed inside her. Margaret now knew that she was a musician. She knew that her grandmother's gift lived on through her. She knew that music had the power to connect people across all boundaries of age and culture and social class. Most importantly, she knew that it was never too late to share your gifts with the world. 3 months after the recital, Margaret stood in front of the music building at the university. She was holding a folder of music, just as she had on that first night at the community center. But this folder was different. It was new and organized, filled with both her grandmother's original songs and new pieces that Margaret had been working on. Dr. Miles had kept his promise to meet with her. The week after the recital, Margaret had taken a bus to the university campus. She had never been to a university before, and she felt nervous walking through the halls where so many smart people studied and worked. But Dr. Miles had been kind and welcoming. He had asked Margaret to play her songs again in his office, which had a beautiful grand piano. He had listened carefully and asked many questions about her grandmother and the musical tradition in her family. "These songs are treasures," Dr. Miles had told her. "They represent a musical heritage that is in danger of being lost. You are the keeper of something very valuable." Dr. Miles had explained that the university had a program for documenting and preserving folk music from different cultures. He wanted Margaret to work with them to record her grandmother's songs so that future generations could learn them. But more than that, Dr. Miles had invited Margaret to perform at the university's monthly faculty recital series. "We need to share your music with a wider audience," he had said. "There are people who need to hear what you have to offer." Tonight was the night of Margaret's first university performance. She was nervous, but it was a different kind of nervousness than she had felt at the community center. Then she had been afraid of being rejected and embarrassed. Now she was nervous because she wanted to do justice to the honor she had been given. Margaret walked into the music building and found her way to the recital hall. It was much larger and more elegant than the community center. The piano on the stage was even more beautiful than the one she had played before. Everything about this place spoke of serious musical tradition. Dr. Miles met her backstage. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Nervous," Margaret admitted, "but also grateful. I never imagined that anyone would want to hear my grandmother's songs in a place like this." "Your grandmother's songs belong in a place like this," Dr. Miles said firmly. "Music is music, whether it comes from a conservatory or from a village in Taiwan. What matters is the truth and beauty it contains." Dr. Miles had also arranged for Margaret to audit some music theory classes at the university. At first, Margaret had been intimidated by the idea of sitting in classrooms with young college students. But the professor had been welcoming, and the students had been curious and respectful. Margaret was learning to read music more formally and to understand the theoretical principles behind the songs she played by ear. But the classes were also learning from her. When she played examples of her grandmother's music, the students could hear how folk traditions used different scales and rhythms than classical European music. "You are teaching us as much as we are teaching you, the theory," Professor had told her. Margaret had also started working with a graduate student named Lisa Wang, who was studying ethnomusicology. Lisa was helping Margaret document not just the melodies of her grandmother's songs, but also their stories and cultural meanings. "These songs are historical documents," Lisa had explained. "They tell us about the lives and experiences of women in rural Taiwan. They preserve ways of thinking about music that are different from Western traditions. Through Lisa, Margaret had learned that there were other people like her, immigrants who carried musical traditions from their home countries. There was a man from Mexico who played traditional guitar. There was a woman from Ethiopia who sang ancient songs. There was a family from Ireland who played folk dances. Margaret was no longer alone in her musical journey. She was part of a community of people who understood that music was more than entertainment. It was a way of preserving culture and connecting people across time and space. Tonight's audience was different from the community center audience. It included music professors and graduate students, as well as community members who were interested in world music. Margaret could see Mrs. Patterson sitting in the third row, wearing another new dress and beaming with pride. When it was time for Margaret to perform, she walked to the piano with confidence. She had learned that her nervousness was not something to be ashamed of. Even famous musicians got nervous before important performances. The nervousness was a sign that what she was doing mattered. Margaret began with the song about missing home, just as she had at the community center. But her playing was even more expressive now. Months of daily practice and formal study had given her new tools for expressing the emotions in the music. The university audience listened with the deep attention that Margaret was learning to expect. These were people who understood music professionally, and they could hear the sophistication and authenticity in her playing. Margaret continued with the song about spring rain and the song about gratitude. But tonight, she also played two new pieces that she had been working on. One was a song that her grandmother had hummed, but never fully taught her. Margaret had reconstructed it from memory and added her own development. The other new piece was completely original. Margaret had composed it to tell the story of her own journey from Taiwan to America, from silence back to music. She called it the song about finding your voice again. When Margaret finished her performance, the audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted even longer than the one at the community center. But more importantly to Margaret, she could see that people had been genuinely moved by the music. After the performance, many people came to speak with Margaret. There were professors who wanted to invite her to play at other universities. There were musicians who wanted to collaborate with her. There were students who wanted to learn more about traditional Chinese music. One conversation was particularly meaningful to Margaret. A young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother was from Korea," the woman said. "She used to sing me songs when I was little, but she died when I was 10. I thought those songs were gone forever. But listening to your music tonight made me remember some of the melodies. Do you think it's possible to learn them again, even if I only remember pieces?" Margaret smiled and took the young woman's hands. "Yes," she said. "Music has a way of staying alive inside us even when we think it's lost. If you have even small pieces of your grandmother's songs, we can help you find the rest." This was what Margaret had learned in the 3 months since the recital. Music was not just about individual performance. It was about community and connection. It was about helping other people find their own voices and preserve their own traditions. Margaret had also made practical changes in her life. She was still working at the hospital, but she had reduced her hours to part-time. Dr. Miles had helped her apply for a small grant that allowed her to spend more time on music and cultural preservation work. Margaret was also teaching private lessons to a few students who wanted to learn traditional Chinese music. Sarah Johnson, the young woman from the community center recital, was one of her students. Margaret was learning that teaching helped her understand her own music more deeply. Most importantly, Margaret had found a new understanding of her place in the world. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just surviving from day to day. She was contributing something valuable to her community. Margaret thought about her grandmother often. She wished Grandma Lee could see what had happened to the songs she had taught to a little girl so many years ago. But in a way, Margaret felt that her grandmother was still with her every time she played. The music had connected Margaret not just to her past, but also to her future. She was working on a project to create a collection of recordings and written music that would preserve her family's musical tradition for future generations. She was also planning to visit Taiwan next year, to see if she could find other people who remembered her grandmother's songs. She wanted to learn more about the musical heritage that had shaped her life. As Margaret packed up her music after the university performance, she reflected on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely woman who played simple songs on a cheap keyboard in a tiny apartment. Tonight, she was a respected musician who had shared her grandmother's gift with appreciative audiences. But the most important change was not in how other people saw her. The most important change was in how she saw herself. Margaret now understood that she had always been a musician, even during the 33 years when she had no piano to play. The music had been waiting inside her, just as her grandmother had promised. Margaret also understood that it was never too late to share your gifts with the world. She had been 52 years old when she first performed in public. There were probably many other people like her, people who had talents and stories that they thought no one would want to hear. Margaret hoped that her example might encourage other people to take their own leaps of faith. She hoped that her story might help other people find the courage to share their gifts, no matter how simple or unusual those gifts might seem. As Margaret walked out of the university music building that night, she felt a deep sense of gratitude.